Hi everyone. In this lecture, we're going to talk about an article reading. The article is titled The Relative Influence of Facial Neoteny and Waist to Hip Ratio on Judgments of Female Attractiveness and Fecundity. This article is written by Furnham and Reeves, and you can find this article in our content folder this week. Now, I will go through with you what each of these terms mean in relationship to the research that we're going to be talking about in this article, as well as how it ties into our chapter that we just covered in class, our introductory chapter to physiological psychology, and specifically how natural selection plays into physiology. First, let's take a look at one of the terms in the title of this article, waist to hip ratio, or WHR for short. This is the ratio between the measurement of the narrowest portion of the waist to the widest portion of the hip. That ratio, considered to be a normal range for that ratio, is anywhere from 0.67 to 0.85. And in evolutionary theory research, in this area of study, this is considered to be a pretty universal wide pass filter, meaning that if you are selecting a mate, it is likely that you're going to use certain criteria to try to select one that will be reproductively successful. And one wide pass filter or one criteria that you could use to narrow down your mate selection would be to focus in on waist to hip ratio. It's likely or more likely that if someone has a healthy waist to hip ratio, meaning that they're more narrow at the waist than they are at the hip, it's more likely that they will be reproductively successful and therefore would be a good mate to select. Now, at this time, I would like to emphasize that this particular type of research and this area of study is not implying that this type of mate selection or any mate selection is done with any conscious awareness, right? So this is all subconscious things that we may notice about each other when we are selecting a mate. And again, the idea is that these preferences have evolved because in the past they have been successful. That is, overall, individuals that have what is considered to be a healthy waist to hip ratio have been more reproductively successful. Therefore, they might be more preferred as a mate. And again, this is a subconscious thing. Now, continuing on with waist to hip ratio, really what this is meant to do is to determine how much fat is stored on your waist, on your hips, and on your buttock. And what is considered to be a healthy waist-hip ratio does vary a bit when you're looking at men versus women. So more weight in the middle section or more of an apple-shaped type of body is associated with a higher risk of several things. Some of these include heart disease, type 2 diabetes, and also premature death. All of these things are associated with having more weight in the midsection or having a higher waist to hip ratio. And in terms of sexual selection, it might be advantageous for an individual to select someone with a lower waist to hip ratio, so they would be at less risk for these things. At this point as well, I want to stress that waist to hip ratio is also different than BMI or body mass index calculations. BMI is calculating the ratio of your weight to your height, whereas again, waist to hip ratio is focused in on the measurements of your waist in ratio to the measurement of your hip. You can technically have a normal BMI calculation, but have a waist to hip ratio that is actually higher than what is considered to be typical or normal and would put you at increased risk. And you would be in the increased risk range if your waist to hip ratio is greater than 0.9 for men or 0.85 for women. Now, we've kind of brushed on this thus far, but let's focus in on now kind of the meat and potatoes of the article in terms of waist to hip ratio. What does this mean in relation to sexual selection of a mate? In the past, what we have found in evolutionary research is that females with larger waist to hip ratios would be excluded as mates sometimes. But what we have also found is that a more narrow second filter is needed. That is, waist to hip ratio might be a good first initial filter to use to try to select a healthy mate, but another filter is needed. So what else are we using to sexually select a mate past waist to hip ratio? Also, males can detect waist to hip ratio, but something that's interesting is that we've also found that it seems to have this waist to hip ratio seems to have more importance than just overall body weight. So just kind of going over, looking at someone's just overall size, that's not the same thing as waist to hip ratio. There's a difference, and it seems as though waist to hip ratio, that measurement between those two areas of the body, take more import than just overall body weight or body mass. Also, several cross-cultural studies, so studies that have been done in different cultures, have shown negative correlations between attractiveness and waist-to-hip ratio. So several studies that have been done, not just here in America, but in other cultures as well, have shown that attractiveness ratings decrease when waist-to-hip ratio increases. So for individuals that are viewing pictures of individuals that have a larger waist to hip ratio, their ratings of those pictures tend to be as being rated as less attractive. So again, a negative correlation between these two. Now we take a look at some more recent criticisms that waist to hip ratio has undergone in this area of study. More recent research has found things that have suggested that BMI might actually be a better predictor in some cases of overall female attractiveness. The lower waist hip ratios aren't always consistently rated as more attractive. Overall, this does seem to be the case, but when the ratio is very low, that is, if the measurement of the most narrow portion of the waist, if that is much, much smaller than the hip measurement, smaller than the normal range, the ratings can actually go the opposite direction. So we can go too far with having a very small waist to hip ratio. So people with very small ratios might actually be rated as less attractive because it's went too far in the opposite direction. There have been some studies in certain areas of the world where overall body weight could be a more powerful predictor of reproductive success or just be more preferred in terms of a mate selection. So we'll discuss that a bit more at the end of this lecture. Also, many previous studies that have looked at waist to hip ratios have used line drawings rather than actual photos of a person. So that obviously could have some implications in terms of the validity of the results. First of all, obviously just the ecological validity of it. We don't see people as line drawings. We see them as real 3D images. So line drawings may not be adequate to really capture the effect or lack thereof of a waist to hip ratio on ratings of attractiveness. And of course, they could just be inaccurate. And also, this could potentially confound weight with an increase in hip or waist size. So it's difficult to tease apart what is waist to hip ratio and what is just overall weight in general of an individual. That's very hard to tease that apart. And with the line drawings in particular, it's not very easy to do that, and it could confound the two. So overall, recent studies have suggested that there could be some issues with just settling on waist to hip ratio as the main criteria for sexual selection of a mate. I want to bring this particular study up as it's mentioned in our article. These are some of the photos that will be used by the authors of this article in their research. This is, I believe, maybe one of the first, if not the first, studies that used digital pictures rather than line drawings to gather attractiveness ratings and to see how they were affected by waist to hip ratio measurements. So what you'll notice is that you'll see 3 photos of the same person or same model, but there have been subtle manipulations to the waist and hip in each one. So best I can tell, I believe the one in the middle is the original. And then what they do digitally is make one that has a larger hip to waist ratio. So they widen the waist, and I think in some cases they might actually narrow the hip. So they make the measurements more similar. And then they do the opposite, where they decrease the waist hip ratio by narrowing the waist and widening the hip. And again, these are subtle differences, right? And they do this for each picture Then they present the picture to participants and they have them give an overall attractiveness rating. So with those pictures in mind, and again, we'll see those again later because they are the ones that were used by the current study that we're reading about in this paper. But the other focus of this paper is not only just waist to hip ratio or perhaps the shortcomings of just focusing in on waist to hip ratio in sexual selection, is looking at other aspects such as the face. So attractiveness ratings of the face could explain more of the variability in attractiveness ratings that we have seen in the past. So this obviously suggests that people perhaps might focus a bit more on the face when looking for a mate or rating people in terms of attractiveness. Now, another question that this kind of brings up is that are these preferences universal? Meaning that are the same factors or features of a face preferred across men and women, but also cross-culturally. This brings us to this idea of neoteny. This is very applicable to facial features. I mentioned neoteny when we were discussing material from chapter 1, and you can also look back at chapter 1 for discussion of neoteny in your textbook as well. But neoteny is just this idea of retention of more youthful or juvenile features in an adult animal. So basically, you looking very young, even though perhaps you are not. So this extended period of adolescence or youth. This can also be used to describe the delayed brain development that we see particularly in humans, but also in other mammals. But this can also be applied to physical features that we see as well, so visible features and especially those in the face. This occurs, like I said, in many species, but especially in humans. And we think that this is because of multiple reasons. Maybe this delayed adolescence, is really allowing for more brain plasticity. So this allows us to learn behavior through experience through a longer period of time. So it allows us to have a more complex brain structure. But it also seems that we are more neotenic than our ancestors, meaning that it seems as though perhaps these more neotenic features are being selected for. Perhaps in certain circumstances, the appearance of youthfulness is more preferred, and therefore those particular individuals that appear more youthful are being selected more often as mates, and those genetics are then passed on to the next generation. And overall, through many generations, it appears as though we are more neotenic today than our ancestors of many, many generations ago. Also, a benefit of appearing more youthful is you have this kind of perceived cuteness. This could also elicit help responses. So if you think about these little guys we're looking at here, if you saw this little tiny puppy and it was alone and looked as though it was maybe having like a fearful response, perhaps seemed hungry, even if you're not an animal person, you would have probably a very difficult time just leaving that tiny little puppy by itself. And instantly when I put those pictures up, you all, at least some of you all, probably had the response of, oh, how cute. Right, they are so cute. And this applies, of course, to human babies, but also babies of other species as well. We have this instinct reaction of, oh, it's so cute. Oh, I want to help them. And this could evolutionarily have a lot of benefit because this little guy is much more likely to survive because he's tiny and cute. And as is this little guy as well. And of course, this little gentleman here. This is my little boy. I wanted to put these pictures up to kind of get that, oh, how cute response from you all, so you could at least be able to kind of conceptualize this idea of elicitation of help. So these are all of the benefits potentially of having more neotenous features physically, but also having this delayed adolescent period for human brain development in particular, but also just mammalian brain development in general. And neoteny is the other focus of this article. So not only waist to hip ratio, but this appearance of youthfulness, neotenic features. How did those factor in when we are selecting mates? So let's discuss more in depth about these neotenous features. Neotenous features are ones that are sexually dimorphic. What this means is that sexes within the same species have different preferences. More specifically, features that are preferred by females are not the same as the ones that are preferred from males. Okay, so let's take a look at female features that tend to be rated well in terms of attractiveness. So first, there's a few that seem to elicit more of a nurturant response, more youthful features. They would include large, widely spaced eyes, small nose and small chin. These are those more youthful features that tend to be rated as being more attractive when females have these features. They are particularly rated well when they're in combination with other features that indicate sexual maturity. These would include wide cheekbones, narrow cheeks, highly set eyebrows, so more raised and shaped eyebrows, wider pupils, a large smile. Overall, combination of these types of features are rated as being more attractive and also rated as being healthy or having fewer health issues and being more fertile as well. So this brings us to the hypotheses made by the authors of this study that we are focused in on right now. So we've discussed waist to hip ratio and neotenous features. And the question is, which play a larger role in judgments of attractiveness? Now, the first hypothesis of this article is that facial attractiveness will influence judgments of overall attractiveness, youthfulness, and healthiness more than waist to hip ratio will. So I want to emphasize here that the picture manipulations of waist to hip ratio, those three manipulations, so the original, the wider version, and then the more narrow version, all of those manipulations are done within a normal waist to hip ratio range. So that 0.67 to 0.85 range for a female, these manipulations stay within that range. So when these manipulations are within a normal range, facial attractiveness or neoteny will play a larger role in judgments of attractiveness and youthfulness and healthiness. That is hypothesis one. Hypothesis two suggests that waist to hip ratio will have a greater influence on ratings of fertility and likelihood of being pregnant than will neoteny. So let's look at the details of the methods of their study. So they used 3 different waist to hip ratio measurements. So they used the original photo as well as a smaller waist to hip ratio version and a wider waist to hip ratio version. They also used 3 levels of neoteny, so low, medium, and high, high being very neotenous or youthful looking, and low being less neotenous, less youthful looking. And we'll talk about here in just a second how they manipulated those pictures. And then lastly, the rating scale. So this was how participants could rate in terms of attractiveness on a scale from 1 to 8, 1 being low and 8 being high attractiveness. They had 161 participants, 60 of which were male. The average age was 21.5 years, age range anywhere from 19 to 66. I think the 66 is an outlier. I'm pretty sure they even mentioned that in the method. Then there was 100 females, and I'm not sure about the one participant that's missing there. 160 don't add to 161. Perhaps they did have to drop a participant for some reason. I'm not sure. But they list that they had 100 females, the average age being 20.57 years, age range anywhere from 18 to 27. These were undergraduate students. 47.5% of them were in their first year of study, and then 52.5% were non-psychology students enrolled in Introduction to Psychology. They were all naive to what waist to hip ratio is, as well as what facial neoteny is. They were all residents of London. 33.7% of them were white Britons, 29.3% were Western European, 27.4% were Asia, 7% were American, 1.2% were Black African or Black Caribbean. The stimuli, let's take a look at their manipulations of the stimuli. So these should look familiar. These were the ones that we saw earlier from the 2000 study. They used these same photos in this particular study as well. They used these figures that were again obtained from the hen study. Two versions of the waist to hip ratios were created using a digital manipulation. So they took the original photo again, which I believe is the one in the middle, and then they made two versions from that of different waist to hip ratios, one that's wider and one that is more narrow or smaller and larger. And here are the different models that they used. So three different models and what the actual waist to hip ratio measurements would be. So here is the original measurement. And again, remember that the average or the normal range is considered to be on average about 0.67 to 0.85. The original measurements being here. These are the digitally manipulated smaller versions of those models, and here is the wider versions of those models. So note that all of these measurements are falling within the normal range, and notice how small the difference is. Very, very subtle. I mean, some of these are extremely close to each other. And I think that this will be more telling when we take a look at the results, the fact that these are so close to each other, but yet it could make a difference in terms of attractiveness ratings. So that is manipulation of waist to hip ratio. Now we look at how they did the facial manipulation for the neotenous features. They used Microsoft Editor, and they originally did a pilot study just to see how their manipulations would be rated before they selected stimuli to be used in the study that we're focused on now. So in their pilot study, they used the software to increase eye size and mouth size, and also to decrease nose size. And they did this in percentage intervals to increase attractiveness ratings. If you remember the neotenous features that we discussed earlier that tend to be rated as being more attractive, they included wider eyes, wider mouth, but also smaller nose, smaller chin. They used this editor to manipulate these particular features in such a way to increase attractiveness ratings. And then they did the reverse to decrease attractiveness ratings. So they manipulated these pictures and gave them to participants in this pilot study. And this right here is just a snippet of how the ratings came out in this particular pilot. So levels of neoteny, so levels of manipulation. So low neoteny versus high neoteny, or high youthfulness, low youthfulness. And they basically selected the faces that were rated as being significantly different from each other. So they were different enough that participants rated attractiveness differently. They selected those particular pictures to be used in this current study that we're discussing right now. So that brings us to the overall stimuli or pictures that they used in this current study. They used 9 prepared photos, and then from those photos, 3 waist to hip ratios were used for each of those stimulus figures. So the original, smaller, and the wider. And within those, they also had 3 levels of facial neoteny, so medium, and then low neoteny, and high neoteny or high youthfulness. So that brings us to 27 photos total that participants would view in this study. Now, the actual procedure they used, they tested everyone in a group setting. They did this twice. The experimenter would explain the instructions to the participant. They would project each picture on the wall for 3 seconds, and participants were given verbal timing warnings that they needed to go ahead and make their attractiveness ratings. They used 2 random presentation orders for the pictures. That was really just to prevent any kind of order effect or just effect of the presentation order of the pictures. So they randomized the order to prevent that. They took 2 minutes afterwards to complete any questions after stimuli ratings, and we'll talk about those questions here when we start looking at the results of this study. And then, of course, the participants were debriefed or explained in more depth what was actually happening within the procedure and what the ratings meant, and basically just kind of explained in more depth what was actually going on after they participated. Okay, let's take a look at some results. So overall ratings of attractiveness. So ratings of attractiveness were lower when waist to hip ratios were higher. We can see that here. So here is the smaller waist to hip ratio, the wider waist to hip ratio. We can see that the ratings are a bit higher for attractiveness when there is a smaller waist to hip ratio than when there is a wider waist to hip ratio. Also, ratings increased or got higher as neoteny increased. So here are the levels of facial neoteny, low, medium, and high. If we take a look over here at the means, this is low neoteny, medium neoteny, and then high neoteny. And we can see that the ratings increase when neoteny is high. Now we look at results for youthfulness. Again, we see increases as waist to hip ratio decreases. So as the waist to hip ratio is more narrow, the pictures are being rated as looking more youthful. So higher ratings for smaller waist to hip ratio than for wider waist to hip ratio. We also see an increase in ratings of youthfulness when neoteny increases. I think this makes very logical sense, but it's nice to have tangible data to support it. So the pictures that have been digitally manipulated to appear more youthful are being rated as being more youthful. And we see those higher ratings here in the medium and high neoteny pictures than in the lower neoteny pictures. Also, they found that when waist to hip ratios were small, those tended to be more preferred when neoteny was medium and high. So a smaller waist to hip ratio is preferred when the pictures are appearing to be more youthful. Now we look at ratings of fertility. They found a positive correlation between ratings of fertility and neoteny. So level of neoteny of the pictures correlated with ratings of fertility such that the more youthful pictures were rated as also being more fertile. So if we look at levels of neoteny here, so again we have the low, medium, and high neoteny, and we're looking at waist to hip ratio, small, original, and wider. We only find an effect of waist to hip ratio at the high levels of neoteny. So that would be here. So we take a look at high level of neoteny. Here is the smaller waist to hip ratio, 5.4, original 5.2, and wider 5.19. Statistically, there is a difference between these ratings. So specifically, the high neoteny pictures that have the smaller waist hip ratio are being rated significantly higher than those from the original and the wider. This is not the case at the other two levels of neoteny, low and medium. So if we take a look at the low levels of neoteny, these ratings here across the different waist to hip ratios, small, original, and wider, don't significantly differ. And they don't at the medium level either. So if we look at the medium level of facial neoteny and the smaller waist to hip ratio, 5.25, original 5.26, wider 5.27, those are not statistically different from each other. We only find that effect for waist to hip ratio at the high levels of neoteny. Interestingly here, the ratings from male participants tended to be lower overall than the female participants. And lastly, overall effects, there was an effect of neoteny on ratings of fertility, but there was not an overall effect of waist to hip ratio. So what you can take away from that in layman's terms is that ratings of fertility didn't seem to be affected by waist to hip ratio, but the youthfulness of the facial features did seem to affect the ratings of fertility. Now we look at ratings of overall healthiness. For males, they rated the smaller waist to hip ratios as being most healthy, followed by the original pictures, and then lastly, the wider waist to hip ratios. This applied to both the medium and the higher levels of neoteny in the pictures. For females, overall, their scores tended to be higher than the males. So in general, female participants were rating these pictures as appearing to be more healthy than males were. Their scores also decreased at the higher levels of neoteny. So for the facial neoteny, for the pictures that were high in facial neoteny, females gave lower scores for both the smaller and the wider waist to hip ratio pictures. And let's see, lastly, there was an effect of both sex. So the sex of the participant, male versus female. So males and females rated these pictures differently, and also an effect of overall neoteny. And we can take a look at that right here. So if we take a look at the mean ratings of healthiness, what we see is a significant jump when the facial neoteny is manipulated from low to medium. We see a big jump here. And again, this is statistically significant, this jump here. This difference from medium to high is not significant. So it seems to matter from low to medium, but not so much from medium to high. But there is an overall effect of youthfulness on the ratings of healthiness. We don't really see the same effect for waist to hip ratio on its influence on ratings of healthiness. We don't really see a statistical difference here between these ratings, only for neoteny, and again, also for sex of the participant, male versus female raters. Lastly, we'll take a look at likelihood of pregnancy. Waist to hip ratio, as was hypothesized, had greater influence on these ratings. And there was no effect of neoteny on these ratings of likelihood of being pregnant. That is, facial features didn't play into the ratings of likelihood of the person in the photo being pregnant. Male ratings for likelihood of pregnancy tended to be higher than the female ratings. And there was a main effect of waist to hip ratio, but again, not for neoteny. So again, in layman's terms, this means that there was an effect of the waist to hip ratio manipulation on pregnancy ratings, but not for facial neoteny. And we can see that right here. So we have our waist to hip ratio, again, smaller, original, and wider. And we see higher ratings of likelihood of being pregnant for the wider waist to hip ratio than for the original, and even lower ratings of likelihood of being pregnant for the smaller waist to hip ratio. And we do not see the same type of effect for facial neoteny. Okay, now these were the questions that were followed in the 2-minute period after the attractiveness ratings and youthfulness ratings, healthiness ratings. These were the extraneous questions that were asked after the fact. So participants were asked to rate explicit features in terms of attractiveness, and both sexes, so both male and female participants, rated the overall face as being the highest. But there was a sex difference for 5 items, and here I'll highlight them here. There was a sex difference for ratings for these 5 body parts in terms of import, in terms of attractiveness ratings. And we can see males rated higher, pretty well consistently on these particular features than the female participants did, with the exception of hair. Females rated hair as being more important. And yep, that's it. So males rated the other 4 that males and females differed on as being more important than female raters did. So let's discuss these findings. These results are a bit different from previous findings in this particular area of research, in that they found little to no effect of waist to hip ratio when they were looking for ratings of attractiveness, youthfulness, fertility, or healthiness. Changes in facial neoteny or youthful appearance of the face in this particular study seemed to overpower waist to hip ratio. That is, the youthfulness of the face seemed to play more into ratings of attractiveness, youthfulness, fertility, and healthiness than waist to hip ratio did. This has been found a few times before, so these particular results do kind of match up with what is being found more recently in the field. So let's focus in on hypothesis 2. So this was the second hypothesis that was proposed that we talked about in the beginning of this lecture. It was partially confirmed in that waist to hip ratio did affect judgments of pregnancy, and while neoteny didn't. So facial features didn't factor into likelihood of pregnancy ratings, but waist to hip ratio did. But fertility judgments were not similarly affected. They were only affected by neoteny. So judgments of whether or not the person in the photo was high in fertility was only affected by facial manipulation. Waist to hip ratio did not affect fertility judgments in this study. So something else again that's interesting is that males consistently gave lower ratings of fertility and healthiness than female raters did. And that's just kind of an aside, something that the authors mentioned. And it's something to kind of ponder and think about maybe why that would be that consistently male participants rated these pictures lower than female participants when rating fertility and healthiness. So what can we conclude from this particular study? What their data suggest is that waist to hip ratio really is only useful in determining whether or not someone is pregnant currently. Now, if someone is pregnant currently, in the immediacy, they're technically infertile. So perhaps in terms of sexual selection, it might be advantageous for you to select a different mate in the immediacy. Now, again, this is not any kind of conscious process. This is an evolutionary selection process. If you're looking for a fertile mate, it's probably advantageous for you in the immediacy to choose one that is not pregnant currently. So the data suggests then that waist to hip ratio may be useful in determining whether or not a potential mate is currently pregnant, but it doesn't really help you do much else. These data that were collected from these experimenters in the current study suggest that neoteny actually serves as a more narrow filter to find a more youthful mate, in turn more fertile and more healthy mate. This also does lend some support that more youthful features are being selected for when selecting a female mate. Further, this could support what is called the good genes hypothesis in biology. Basically, this hypothesis just suggests that the female is choosing different traits that are going to lead to superior viability in their offspring. Again, it's more focused in on the female choosing of a mate, but it does support this overall good genes hypothesis. And their final conclusion is that the face may be seen as a more honest predictor of true fitness. So true fitness meaning reproductive fitness. How likely is it that you are going to be successful in reproducing? Perhaps your face or the features of your face and how youthful they are, they may be a better predictor of how successful you will be reproductively than waist to hip ratio is. And that is in contrast to what has been thought in the past. So now let's talk about some limitations of this study. This was self-report, especially when we focus in on those explicit feature ratings that were done after the initial attractiveness and youthfulness, healthiness ratings, when they were asked specific physical characteristics that they rated as being more important when doing mate selection. This was self-report, and when you do self-report, there is always a limitation. Also, they only manipulated 3 pictures in this particular study. That's not a lot of pictures. And the sample of participants used was very homogeneous, meaning that there wasn't a lot of diversity in participants used in this particular study. So if a more diverse population was sampled, the results could vary. Also, this particular study can't generalize the lack of effect found for waist to hip ratio onto BMI. That is, we can't say from this particular study and its results that BMI doesn't factor into mate selection. So we can't generalize the lack of effect of waist to hip ratio to also include a lack of an effect for BMI. Also, cross-cultural evidence suggests that there may be a negative relationship between weight and attractiveness. So basically, if you did this particular study in a different culture, you may get different results. If you think about cultures where there is a lot of food scarcity, weight may indicate fertility. That is, if somebody is extremely thin, that may indicate infertility. So you may find kind of an inverse result. In Western cultures, we see waist to hip ratio, and overall, it does seem to be maybe a bit more of a cue for fertility because we do have a food abundance in most Western culture. So again, we may see a different result with waist to hip ratio than would a culture that has more food scarcity. So the overall point here to take away is that if we did this study in a different culture, we may find varying results. So all of these are limitations that are mentioned at the end of this particular article. So in the last few minutes here, let's take a look at a few thoughts. based upon the findings of this article and their conclusions, let's think about a few things like male ratings and how they were just lower overall than the female participants rated in terms of healthiness and fertility. Why would male ratings be lower? I don't have an answer for that. I have a ponderance, but I don't have an answer. I would say perhaps maybe that males would be a bit more discriminating. That is, that perhaps they're just being more picky, and maybe there's an evolutionary reason for that. Maybe males were honed in on different features than females were when they took ratings of those explicit physical characteristics that were more important. Males rated different characteristics as being more important than females did. Maybe this played a role when rating healthiness and fertility. Maybe males were focused on different features than females were, and maybe that's why their ratings were lower. Or maybe they're just more discriminating. Just something to think about. This is an interesting one. When I read this article the first time, I immediately thought of the cosmetic industry. Now, if we think about what tends to be preferred, how items in the cosmetics industry tend to be marketed, the overall marketing is, hey, you want to look more beautiful, you want to look more youthful. Well, what does that mean? That could mean, and I am not picking on the Kardashians, I'm just using this as an example. This has changed over time, right? This is Kim Kardashian. This was a photo, I think, from 10, 12 years ago, maybe, and then a more current photo. What do we notice? We notice that overall, we have more neotenous features. The makeup has been changed. We see a raised brow, wider cheekbones. Those are things that indicate sexual maturity, but we also see a smaller nose, smaller chin. The makeup has been changed and altered to widen the eyes, narrow the nose, and I'm not even mentioning the possibility of cosmetic surgery or Botox or anything like that, but that's also a potential possibility. Here we're looking at Kylie Jenner. Look at the difference here. I think this difference is probably a less than 10-year difference, but overall we see the trend is more towards a more youthful appearance in terms of a smaller nose, smaller chin, but then also more sexually mature features of wider cheekbones, larger smile, wider eyes. And last is Khloe Kardashian. Wider eyes, more narrow nose, larger mouth. These are things, again, that can be achieved by plastic surgery, but then also just cosmetics, makeup. And think about how these things are marketed. They tend to be marketed toward being more youthful and more sexually attractive to enhance these particular features that seem to be evolutionarily preferred when selecting a mate. Now, please don't think that I am disparaging the use of makeup or plastic surgery. By all means, you do you. I think everybody should do what they want to do. But it's interesting, the preferences that we see when we're doing evolutionary research can be reflected in something like the cosmetic industry. Because these preferences exist, these products can be marketed in such a way to heighten sales. Now, lastly, let's look at neoteny and physiology. So again, neoteny is that term for delayed physiological development, so more youthful time. What does this cause in the long term? What can cause retention of youthful traits in adults? And why would, and I think we have to consider, because we do see evidence that this is being selected for, so why is this useful? Why would we select for it? Well, I mean, it could indicate healthiness and fitness. As we see, a more youthful appearance is rated as being more healthy and more fit. Also, it could yield a nurture response from others. That is, people may feel the need to take care of you, whether you are a human or a non-human species like a dog or a cat or something like that. It would be advantageous to be taken care of and nurtured. So this type of nurture response is useful, and perhaps that's why it's selected for and preferred in natural selection. And also in terms of the brain, focus on the brain, it gives the brain more chance for development and specialization. If you have a more delayed period, more of a chance for development and change through experience, it gives you a chance to develop a more complex brain. That could be advantageous as well. And lastly, I'd like to mention domestication. So if we think about how we tend to breed dogs and cats and things like that, we tend to select for certain behaviors and certain traits. And these are usually neotenous features. This is actually an adult dog, but it looks like a puppy. That is because in this particular breed of dog, these youthful looking features, floppy ears, big wide eyes, tend to be more selected for and bred for. So what we see is a change in domestication of a lot of species that we breed because we are selecting for specific traits and behaviors that we see that we want. So overall, this has an effect on domestication of species. So these are just some things to think about in terms of what we can conclude and how we can potentially apply the findings of this particular study to our understanding of physiology and how our physiology may be changed because of natural selection and sexual selection. Again, selection that we've been talking about in this article is not something that's done consciously, right? This is something that's happening unconsciously. These are things that just tend to be preferred because overall they tend to indicate successful reproduction. So I hope that this article was, if nothing else, interesting for you all to read. I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and I hope that moving forward as we get into chapter 2 next week, you have something to think about in terms of why physiologically we are the way that we are, not only humans, but other species as well. Have a wonderful day.